Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we are in our second chapter, but also not the second chapter of our book, Miracles, The Credibility of the New Testament Accounts by Craig Keener. And if you haven't been with us so far yet on this book, what we're doing is we're plopping ourselves right in the middle of the book, and we're wanting to get to Hume. We've got our sights set on David Hume, and we are kind of taking this few chapters here and discussing kind of skepticism as it comes to miracles. And the last couple episodes, we discussed what ancient historians thought of miracles, and we found out that they wrote about it, but they wrote about it in such a way that skepticism of them were possible, or at least an ability to distinguish between an accounting of miracles within a story and then oversaturizing your accounts just to make sales of your historical accounts, but also
Go figure, right?
the corporate press still existed even in ye old times. So we said that no, pretty much everyone agrees that miracles of anybody's account are weird. And so it's what do historians do when it comes to miracles? And it only seems like up until recently, our historians of today, rather than ye old, may give ink to those miracle accounts, but they kind of push to the side those people that have a historical eyewitness of something, but also pepper in accounts of miracles. They kind of wash it out and say, well, they can't be trusted on these things, so you can't trust them on everything. But if that were the case, then we'd throw out a lot of history.
Yeah.
And so that's what we talked about in the past two episodes, so you can go back and get to there. But now we're to the point of getting into kind of the critique on the man who is kind of known for today's standard for accounting of miracles, which says that you can't
Or discounting of them anyway.
Right, exactly. There's no account for accounting for them. And so we are in of our book, and so this is kind of part two within the book. And so we said that the book is a little bit on the pricier side, and so we kind of understand if you don't want to pick it up, but all the links are there below to grab them, and also to Keener's kind of more popular work too. But that's what you pay us the hard-earned money for. So we're in the middle of part two, Are Miracles Possible? And we're on chapter 5, Hume and the Philosophic Questions. So Keener starts off here with a quote from David Hume. He says, "A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature." So there's Hume's definition, and I'm sure we're never going to talk about this definition again, except for later in the chapter here. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. So then Keener goes on to says that he's noted the central thrust of this book is that eyewitnesses do offer miracle reports, whatever the claim's actual explanation. The secondary and more potentially controversial point, however, is to invite consideration of potentially supranatural explanations as a legitimate explanatory option.
Well, yeah. And he says that what is important to note, at least in this particular chapter, is that the assumption that suprahuman activity is impossible is an interpretive grid, not a demonstrated fact. Right. So we look at a particular historical account, and he says we put a grid over it to determine, how we're going to interpret it. And so if we interpret it, if we see a particular account, he says, with regard to miracle, there's a particular interpretive grid that we look through in order to make that determination. And he says, worldviews, one worldview might expect miracles, whereas another doubts them. But notice, each interprets experiences and phenomena accordingly. Both worldviews, however, are equally presuppositions. And so we're going to have to get beyond those and deal with those if we want to, try to come to some assessment of a particular account. And
Right.
Part of what he's going to do here is to examine Hume's presuppositions with regard to his arguments against miracles. He's going to do more specifically as we get into later chapters, but this is kind of an introduction for him with regard to Hume.
Right. So, if your worldview does not allow for oranges in your world, you've been eating nothing but apples, you have apple trees outside of your house, and you can't stand those people that believe in oranges, and someone gives you an orange to try out, and you say, well, that's super tasty, but that's a weird tasting apple. no, that's an orange. Well, no, it can't be an orange because oranges don't exist in my universe. So those are just weird. So, you drink orange juice. Well, no, that's not orange juice. That's just a different flavor of apple juice. Oranges do not exist in my world. So therefore, no matter what we present to you as an orange that has all the consistency of orange, it has all the orange look of the orange taste. If your worldview does not allow you to get beyond your presuppositions, then no matter you could have a orange thrown in your face, and you could still not accept an orange. And so that's what Hume seems to be doing here, or at least what Keener is saying that Hume is doing here. All right, so what's going to be addressed in this chapter? Well, in this chapter and in the next one, Keener is going to argue that the reigning paradigm of anti-supernaturalism is only a presupposition, one that need not coercively shape our interpretation of miracle reports in later chapters. After noting that 18th century philosopher David Hume's opposition to affirming miracles was not the only Enlightenment empiricist approach, he'll argue that, which may be mind-blowing in and of itself, because Hume seems to be a staple that people keep going back to, and might have been the only game in town. The Enlightenment was pure skepticism, and it paved the way. I was just watching a debate between Michael Jones and Lawrence Krauss, where Lawrence Krauss was attributing all development during the Enlightenment to humanism, and saying that anytime that anyone did anything during the Enlightenment, it was not in spite of their Christianity. It was only going to the secular humanism approach to it. So he was gobbling up all scientific advancement from the Enlightenment, because he just viewed all of it as a secular humanist
as apples.
Yeah, exactly. No matter if people said no, I'm doing this in the name of the orange.
Yeah.
So it was quite impressive. Well, impressive in that it wasn't so impressive, especially for Krauss. But that's a digress there. So to succeed logically in his approach, it must presuppose atheism or deism. So Hume must presuppose atheism or deism. That is, it is not a neutral argument. Of course, we as presuppositionalists know that there can be no such thing as a neutral argument, but Hume seems to want to kind of present that case here. And in its conclusion does not inevitably follow unless one can establish this unspoken premise. So again, we're wanting to take an internal critique of Hume's approach, and so we're going to want to hit from the basis, and then if we can topple the foundation, then everything else will come tumbling down.
Right. So these are the various, I think he lists 5 here issues that he's going to raise with Hume. This first one is this idea of, it's a presupposition. It's not a neutral argument. Secondly, Hume defines away miracles, he tells us, based on a deterministic reading of natural law. And he says that this approach was hardly inevitable, as may be recognized from its contrast with the approach of most of the folks in the early Enlightenment who were scientists. So Hume really is going against the grain here, because most of the people didn't hold the type of, deterministic reading of natural law that Hume had. Thirdly, and more problematic, he tells us, many critics today point out that the metaphysical assumptions informing Hume's argument here do not work in light of modern physics. And so we kind of expand on that as well. Yeah. And then fourthly, and most important, he says, contrary to Hume's claim to be reasoning inductively, Hume works in a deductive, circle, as scholars often noted. So he's going to suggest that, some of Hume's arguments are circular, quite frankly. He says that Hume argues based on experience that miracles do not happen, yet dismisses credible eyewitnesses' testimonies for miracles, that is, other people's experience, on his assumption that miracles do not happen. Well, that's clearly circular, right? Based on experience, miracles don't happen. Well, what about their experience? Well, yeah, but that means that they don't happen because it's based on experience. Well, you can't have it both ways there. Finally, he says he's going to suggest that today the testimony of evidence from miracles is overwhelming compared with what was available to Hume in his day. And so those are the 5 major areas that he wants to go after Hume regarding his particular position.
Right. We're holding either digitally or physically two volumes to attest to that. Well, in contrast to some elements of this book, this chapter is not a positive argument for miracles or even the existence of extra-normal phenomenon. It is rather intended to show why scholars are not entitled to simply dismiss the possibility of supernatural causation for some extra normal experiences. So they won't have a leg to stand on after this section of the book.
All right, so he starts off this first section, he calls it the nature of the questions. And he says a limited methodological naturalism interprets phenomena on natural terms when possible, right? So here's a particular event that happens in the world, and we consider it with regard to, natural terms. He says, with or without possible divine providence at work, and looks for natural causes and effects. He calls this a limited methodological naturalism. And he says many of the early modern scientists who pioneered such an approach did so while affirming Christian beliefs. So yes, they looked at it from a naturalistic perspective, but they didn't throw out Christian beliefs. They were contending that the Creator designed the universe to act usually in predictable ways. And so notice the assumption here is God created the universe in such a way that we then can observe it and understand the ways that it's acting and make predictions as a result of that. He says this valuable heuristic tool, that is, this limited methodological naturalism, should not, however, be confused with a thoroughgoing philosophic naturalism that a priori rejects the possibility of actively reflecting suprahuman intelligent activity. Right? So he makes a distinction between a limited methodological naturalism that says, okay, what's the best natural explanation for this, versus a philosophic naturalism that says there's no such thing as suprahuman intelligent activity. All we have is nature.
Right.
And so he makes that distinction here. And he says most of the folks who were doing science at the time had Christian beliefs. And so they weren't philosophic naturalists, but they did use a limited methodological naturalism for their approach.
Right. They attempted to not God in the gaps it as much as possible. So, and again, we looked at in chapter 4, we talked about how the fact that even the New Testament itself says that these miracles are unnatural, that they're not in the normal ways. In fact, calling it a sign, most miracles as being a sign or a message to be interpreted through a fulfillment of prophecy. That's the main reason that miracles did happen in the New Testament as a thing to stand out on purpose. And so that's something that carries through to even the Christians of the Enlightenment period. All right, so for general purposes used here, a miracle may be defined, and here's Keener's definition rather than Hume's. Miracle can be defined as an extraordinary event with an unusual supernatural cause. Although this definition is problematic for a number of vantage points. It's problematic from a conventional theistic perspective because all that is natural has an ultimate supernatural cause. It's also problematic because extraordinary or unusual are normally a matter of degrees. The relevance of these terms, applicably in a given case, may thus prove subject to much contention. And showing an event to be demonstratively supernatural is also epistemologically problematic, especially given different observations, varying standards for proof. Nevertheless, among the range of proposed definitions, this one can function as useful to the discussion. So it may not be the perfect hone in all the sides, but for the purposes of the discussion here, a miracle should be defined as an extraordinary event with an unusual supernatural cause.
All right. He says, as events, phenomena that people interpret as miracles can be examined scientifically and historically, debates about interpretation notwithstanding, right? So that's an interesting claim. Like, these things can be examined both scientifically and historically.
Yeah.
And he says, regardless of causation, a person either did, for instance, recover from a disease, or they didn't. And that can be examined, right, scientifically and historically. And although we quite often lack access to information that makes the initial diagnosis certain, we can still take a look at it. Historians, he said, may treat events without expressing certainty about their causes, right? The idea here is that did they recover from a disease, yes or no, right? He says, never, and we don't have to look at their causes, but nevertheless, it's also customary in most disciplines to hypothesize about possible causes. Disciplines that customarily do this include history and medical science and so forth.
Sure. Yeah. So, if we know that a person has a disease and this is easily treatable, and we pump them full of drug X and they're supposed to get better because drug X always works for this, well, then they don't get better. Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, this is entirely God's will, that this person should die because they're going against this, or have we missed something? So that's something, or vice versa, right? We don't say, well, let's throw off all of science or of the medical establishment because in this one area, what we thought was going to be the case wasn't the case. So we don't do that either. So again, that falsifiability that people always want to harp on tends to be something of a sticky wicket at times as well. Well, to exclude the possibility of some sort of supranatural, suprahuman, and possibly supernatural intelligence causation is to a priori rule out what may be a very plausible explanation of some evidence. How does the critic know that miracles do not happen? The critic may argue, like David Hume, for the uniformity of human experience against miracles, a circular argument that excludes the evidence of the claims supposedly under consideration, and others claim it. I know they don't exist because miracles aren't possible. Well, I'm giving you an example of a miracle. Well, I know that can't be a miracle because miracles aren't possible. Well, again, I'm giving you an orange and you're saying oranges don't exist. So you're not going to be able to accept any evidence, right? There's nothing short of you going against your own mind to make you admit that that's the case. Or the critic may contend from an atheistic standpoint that one knows that God or other suprahuman intelligences do not exist, and hence cannot provide a source of supernatural phenomenon. So this is a miracle. Well, miracles may be possible, but I know that it can't be from God. Okay, where does it come from? Well, it can't be from God. So this is just something that happens that we don't have an explanation for. That could also be the case. So you're admitting to the phenomenon, but you're saying, well, let's just give it a little bit of time and we'll figure out a cause that will be useful and explanatory under my presuppositional worldview.
Right. So how our critics know miracles don't exist? First, well, because experience shows that miracles don't exist. Well, that's the question that we're asking. Does experience show that miracles exist? So when you say because experience, it goes against experience, well, you're begging the question. That's a circular kind of thing, right? So that's the first one. The other one is, well, because God doesn't exist. Right. Well, again, you have to show that. You just can't make that as a claim, right? So those are the two issues that he wants us to see there. He says more reasonably, though, outside of those two particular issues, the critic may argue that since there is no consensus about God's existence, a critic is excused from considering this as a cause. So there's no consensus, there's disagreement, and therefore we don't have to, allow God to be causally connected to this particular phenomenon. Yet he says historians offer hypotheses about all sorts of causes on which there is no consensus. So just because there's no consensus doesn't mean that you can't talk about a cause, right? He says historians do that all the time. He says, but even if the historian reasonably decides not to pronounce judgment on causation, it does not logically follow that one may say that such a historian has disproved divine causation, or that any historical evidence has ruled out such causation. All we can say is they decided not to talk about it. That doesn't mean that it's ruled out or they disproved it, right? He says to make such a claim is entirely circular, consulting nothing more than a restatement of the presuppositions with which one began the discussion.
Right. And it's one in contention as well. Moving on to Hume's argument from nature, as many scholars today note, anti-supernaturalism is little more than a presupposition. It's rarely argued, and it's rarely seeking to marshal evidence. It just, if you're a historian, if you're working in these fields, then you better be anti-supernaturalism, because why are you even here? Why are you doing science if you believe that there's the possibility of something outside of science? Well, that just is the presupposition in question here. And again, he says it's rarely argued and rarely to be presented as evidence. You are just supposed to be that. Well, 17th and 18th century rational philosophy, rather than any specific evidence, is largely responsible for the usual summary dismissal of beliefs in supernatural phenomenon in modern academy. So we hearken back to, well, it's always been this way, well, at least 17th and 18th century. So, we've got a good track record so far.
Right. And so what he does here is he kind of lays out who really one of the most influential philosophers and thinkers who talked about this. He says more influentially than most earlier thinkers, 17th century philosopher Benedict de Spinoza, right? So Spinoza argued that miracles are self-contradictory. Why? Well, it was based on his monistic identification of God with the natural order. So the natural order is God,
Right.
right? So how the nature works is how God works. And so God doesn't do things extraordinary beyond nature because that's not, who God is and how he works, because how nature works is how God works. And so Spinoza viewed laws of nature as, notice, identical with God or God's will. Thus, on his approach, if any miracle reports are true, they must have naturalistic explanations not yet discovered, an approach that has persisted, right? And so that's what you were explaining earlier. Well, it has to have a naturalistic explanation, right? Spinoza said it has to have it's not a miracle. It's just it's the way God works if the event happened, because that's, how nature works is how God works, because God is nature, right? Or at least part of how things works. So Spinoza viewed miracles as, notice, self-contradictory because he believes that the divine nature is identical with natural law. And so everything that happens is how God is doing things, because natural law is who God is, and that's how he works. Right. So there's no extraordinary or beyond natural laws, because everything that happens is part of natural law.
It's pretty impressive that you can just define out your contention. So, when it comes to the resurrection, well, Jesus, he drank a healing potion and he rolled a natural 20. And so he was able to bounce back. Whatever natural thing that causes him to get better, that must be the explanation, because, again, we cut off our leg and we say, well, at least I don't have athlete's foot. Yet if one does not rule out the existence of a single intelligent source like God of most theists, theism offers a particularly useful rational explanation. If with most theists one attributes the origin of the universe to divine causation, one can argue by analogy that divine activity on a smaller scale, even in events involving the creation of new matter and energy, is a priori plausible. And again, just today, I was going over the laws of thermodynamics with a few kids that I teach. And pretty much, if you follow the laws of thermodynamics, it's impossible to have an atheistic point of view with those. And of course, you can tweak those rules as well. And not saying that atheists don't have an answer for it, but as it stands, as it sits, you have to either make special pleading to things, outside the normal rules, or you have, a given moment in which you can say, well, this had to happen first, and then you were able to have the laws of thermodynamics follow the normal ways. But it definitely couldn't be God. You couldn't have an intelligent come in and start that off and then still have that. That's entirely impossible. But you have to have something so small that nothing explodes and creates everything. So that's science. But to say an intelligent being outside of the system can put in those things into effect, well, then you're just crazy talk, and we can't even consider that. So Spinoza's naturalism helped set the default approach for later naturalistic methodology and the conclusions it was designed to achieve. So he kind of kicked it off. It wasn't quite Hume, it was Spinoza. And then he said, well, let's define out, the biblical Christian God, and just say, well, God could exist, but he's definitely just the laws of nature themselves. So it's kind of like pantheism approach to who God is, or at least a somewhat deist approach.
Yeah. It's more pantheism than deism. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So that's kind of the first half of this particular section in this chapter. He goes on to talk about Hume and the philosophy of science, but you want to end it here and then pick that up at the next go round?
Yeah. So usually what we do is kind of split up a chapter into two parts, but because this is tend to be a more scholarly work, we're going to split it up and probably have, I'm looking at what we covered so far, maybe about six versions of it. So if you're reading along with us and you haven't gotten through all of chapter 5 yet, well, you're able to have another week. until we come back. So you can always check out the past episodes, caveofthecross.com. We're also on YouTube and Spotify and Rumble. And then, of course, all the short clips. And I've been starting to do a little test drive with some reels and short clips to help more devolve the focus of the youth. So I'm following in the footsteps of Socrates by corrupting the youth even further. So I'm just doing what the philosophers told me to do. So all that can be found on YouTube as well. And so hopefully the way of going through those at smaller paces may be helpful to you, or watching them back to back or what have you, which you can find again on all those platforms. So join us next time as we continue chapter 5 and dismantling Hume, as Craig Keener does very well in this book. And of course, we always say thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.